Mark's farm had always been a quiet refuge for us, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Here, there was no rush, only a slow rhythm that underscored my husband's calm confidence in his own space. He immediately took charge of tasks, talking with the workers, outlining their plans for the coming days, and even briefly discussing his ideas with me. Our relationship was quite tolerable, even good. We both cherished each other, though sometimes overlooked the small things. An unexpected engine sound distracted me. Sam and his girlfriend Emily had arrived. Sam was Mark's nephew, young and charismatic as if life was just starting to unfold. He wasn't even 25, but his gaze, his posture, and his calm assurance were somehow captivating. I smiled, catching myself feeling a strange excitement. We rarely saw each other, and each time he seemed slightly more mature than before, as if each visit marked a new step in his independent life. When we all settled at the dining table, Emily, engrossed in her stories, didn't notice Sam's fleeting glances in my direction. They were brief eye contacts, barely noticeable, but enough to spark an unexpected feeling in me, a slight warmth under my skin that made me hold his gaze a little longer. He responded with a short smile and a nod, as if we shared something known only to us. Since morning, Mark was busy organizing tasks, discussing with a few local workers what needed to be done, where and by whom. While I tried to help in the kitchen, he occasionally tossed questions at me. Did you order the fertilizer for next week? Or, do you think we should repaint the fence before winter? Simple, seemingly insignificant questions, but between them lay a slight tension. It wasn't serious, just minor disagreements, as if reminding us that despite living together and sharing a home, we sometimes had different priorities. He went outside, leaving me alone in the kitchen, immersed in chores and silence. As I reached for the glasses, the door opened, and there stood Sam. He walked over, looked around, and asked if I needed help. I smiled, surprised by his unexpected care. That morning, his presence felt particularly weighty. He was close with a slight smile, and his silence created a special atmosphere in which I suddenly felt as if he filled the whole house. Sam began to take dishes down from the top shelves. At one point, our hands accidentally touched as I reached for a glass. A barely noticeable touch, yet I suddenly felt a strange tremor in my fingers, a sudden response, as if something long dormant had awakened inside me. I caught his gaze and saw that he had noticed it too. No unnecessary words, just a brief look, full of something unexplored. Emily was nearby but completely engrossed in her affairs, looking at recent photos or checking messages on her phone. Her lack of attention added a kind of forbidden ease to the moment with Sam. It was as if he and I were in a separate reality, where nothing and no one could distract us from each other. The next morning brought with it the familiar calm of the farm. Outside, the muffled sounds of workers were already echoing. Someone was talking in the distance. And as usual, Mark had set up the coffee in the kitchen and headed out to tackle the tasks we had discussed the day before. I wanted to slow the morning, stretch it into long minutes, and decided that now was the perfect time for a hot bath. I went to the bathroom and, looking around, thought once again that a curtain was definitely needed here. The open shower space always gave a slight feeling of exposure, especially when the house was full of people. Maybe it was just a feeling, but I had mentally postponed this minor adjustment several times already. Pushing the thought aside, I turned on the water and sank into the warmth, letting my body relax and my thoughts flow freely. Water streamed down my shoulders and back, washing away the remnants of sleep and worry. In the quiet of the farm, I didn't need to hurry anywhere, and I allowed myself to fully dissolve in the moment, closing my eyes and imagining that outside this bathroom nothing else existed. I thought about how good it felt to sometimes hide from the urban hustle and become part of the silence, warm and almost tangible. Immersed in my thoughts, I didn't hear the bathroom door open. Only when I heard a faint sound did I instinctively turn around, and my heart immediately jumped from surprise. Sam was standing there. He froze, clearly not expecting to see me there, and I, caught off guard, remained still, feeling a hot wave of embarrassment rise to my cheeks. For a moment, surprise flickered in his gaze, which was quickly replaced by something unintentionally mesmerizing. It seemed like the room filled with invisible electricity in that instant. I noticed his gaze quickly passing over me, as if he was trying to grasp what he was seeing, and then immediately look away. But he didn't quite succeed. In that gaze, there was something more than just a chance encounter. And surprisingly, instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt strangely approved. I covered myself with my hands, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. Something inside seemed to anchor me to his gaze. I felt a slight shiver across my skin, a response from the awareness that I was standing before him in this almost transparent, intimate cloud of steam and warmth. He still stood there, not moving, and I couldn't quite say what he was thinking, but that brief moment left an almost tangible connection between us. Finally, Sam seemed to come to his senses and awkwardly stepped back to the door, muttering an apology. "Sorry, Lily, I thought no one was here." He was clearly embarrassed and almost hastily exited, carefully closing the door behind him. I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway and slowly released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Returning to my thoughts, I felt a strange calm slowly settle, as if I had once again found myself in someone else's eyes. His gaze. Just a gaze, but within it there was some hidden warmth. This feeling swept over me, leaving behind a faint sense of vulnerability that, oddly, I even liked. It had been a long time since I had felt this way, not just as a woman, but as someone significant in someone's world. Wrapping myself in a towel, I stood for a long time, listening to the residual noise of water and my own thoughts. A strange, almost childlike excitement washed over me, something I couldn't immediately comprehend. Perhaps it was all just an accident, a silly encounter that meant nothing more. But something deep within my subconscious hinted that I might be mistaken. When I went down to the living room, Emily, seemingly unaware of anything unusual, sat at the table, busy with her phone. She turned to me, smiled, and started talking about some plans, interrupting my thoughts. I listened to her, but every time Sam's gaze flickered somewhere in my peripheral vision, I found myself returning to that moment in the bathroom. The sunny morning on the farm arrived quietly and warmly, wrapping us in a gentle light. We had breakfast outside, and at some point Sam offered to help me with the garden. It seemed like nothing special, just a casual offer, but there was an effortless willingness to be close in his words. I accepted the help, and we headed to the flower beds, where a bit of tidying up was needed. We worked in silence, side by side, exchanging brief remarks about the weather and work now and then, until Sam turned to me with a slightly more serious look on his face. "Lily, do you actually enjoy living here, on the farm?" he asked, continuing to tie up the stems in the beds. I paused for a moment before answering, as though something in his question had pierced deeper than mere polite curiosity. "It's hard to say. This place is certainly different from the city. It's peaceful, slow-paced. I enjoy being here, but the city still feels like home." I smiled, but there was something unclear, unspoken in its shadow. Sam nodded, listening intently, and I felt as if I could continue, as though he was ready to accept all my doubts and thoughts, even those I wasn't always brave enough to voice. "You know," I continued, smoothing the soil beside the flower bed, "sometimes it feels like Mark and I are too absorbed in our own things. I'm not complaining, really, it's just, sometimes there's a lack of those little moments where you're reminded that you're important, that beside you is a living person, not just a life partner." Sam listened attentively, his eyes slightly squinted, but without interrupting. His gaze held a genuine interest, something warm and intangible. And for the first time in a long while, I found it easy to speak. He didn't ask a single unnecessary question, nor did he give any word of reproach or silent judgment, just support, which I realized I had been seeking for a long time. "Sometimes it feels like Mark and I are moving out of inertia, just going forward without looking back," I continued. "Maybe that's normal in long relationships, but sometimes it's not enough. It's like I'm here, but not entirely." Sam looked at me thoughtfully, and in his gaze I saw an understanding I'd been missing. He didn't look at me with pity or sympathy. He simply understood, and that was enough to make me feel seen. "I understand. And you know, you deserve something more, Lily. Something real for you," he said quietly, slightly touching my hand as he helped me put on a glove that just wouldn't fit right. When his fingers slid over mine, I felt a slight spark, as though something long forgotten had come alive inside me with his touch. This fleeting gesture, strangely, meant more than dozens of words. Sam didn't hurry to remove his hand, and I didn't pull mine away either. I simply let the moment linger a little longer than it should have. His warm hand covered mine, and I didn't want it to end. The silence around us suddenly became deafeningly loud, and I felt an excitement rising somewhere within. It wasn't a feeling of guilt or shame, but rather an unexpected emotional surge, as though during the time spent in his company, I'd started remembering that part of myself I had long been suppressing. Sam knew how to listen, how not to judge, and that was something precious to me. For a moment, our eyes met again, and I realized that his presence made me feel alive. In the last few days, I felt as if an invisible tension was thickening around us. Sam had become like a warm, quiet presence in my life, one I tried not to think about too much, but which, as it turned out, was beginning to occupy a space in my mind involuntarily. It was a sense of calm and slight excitement at the same time, a shadow of new energy I couldn't shake off. Emily, it seemed, had also sensed the changes. Throughout the day, I caught her quick glances at Sam several times, and each time it was as if she silently asked him a question. She herself remained serene, but it was clear to me that her alertness was growing, though her suspicions had yet to take shape. It was as if someone had accidentally shifted part of our lives, and now she only had to realize exactly what. Mark, on the other hand, was increasingly absorbed in work. There was always something to do on the farm, and his focus on details only grew with each day. Perhaps he enjoyed the opportunity to fully immerse himself in the farm chores without distractions. The more involved he was, the more I felt this inner loneliness, not just the feeling of a lack of closeness, but rather an emptiness, as if I was simply unnoticed. Every time I tried to talk to him about something other than the farm, he cut the conversation short, citing yet another task or exhaustion. And this neglect of the small details of our life, stirred a strange irritation in me. I couldn't share what was building up inside me with him, and the more I tried to find some points of connection, the sharper I realized that these attempts remained unseen. One afternoon, when Mark went out again on some errand, I sat on the porch, leaning on the wooden railing and lost in my thoughts. I watched the field bathed in warm sunlight and allowed myself to just be alone with the feeling of that silence. At that moment, I heard Sam approaching the porch. He stopped nearby and, after a slight hesitation, sat down beside me, silently watching the sunset with me. "Are you okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. There was no pushiness or demand in his voice, and I felt his simple question touch something deep within. Answering him felt natural, as if I were talking to someone who genuinely listened to me. "Sometimes I feel like I'm becoming invisible," I whispered, not even knowing why I said it out loud. "Unimportant." Sam nodded quietly without looking away, and his silent understanding made me feel almost renewed. I didn't know if he fully understood what I meant, but his presence seemed to tell me that I wasn't alone. I felt a strange yet warm sensation in my chest, something that slowly awakened, like the first green in spring. It was too new for me to admit what was happening, but I felt something shifting inside my soul in an intangible way. The evening on the farm was warm but heavy, as if thick with something invisible, while Mark and I tried to end the day in our usual silence. It started as a brief conversation, discussing what needed to be done in the coming days, and everything would have ended there if Mark hadn't suddenly pointed out that I had done something wrong again. A completely trivial thing, some minor detail in the work plan that he would probably forget by the next morning. But his tone, his way of speaking suddenly awakened all the pent-up irritation in me, as if our warm evenings on the farm were just a cover for hidden tension that we had both long ignored. I tried to argue, to explain my point of view, but Mark brushed it off, adding something sharp and hurtful, in a momentary impulse that he would probably think unimportant the very next second. "Maybe for once you could try to hear me?" I replied sharply, no longer able to hold back the disappointment and frustration that had been building up between us over the past few weeks. He looked at me with bewilderment, then with irritation. It seemed our lives had turned into a series of reproaches and silent acknowledgments that no one was trying to fix. I expected him to answer, but instead he threw one last displeased look, turned around, and went outside toward the barn. His footsteps faded slowly beyond the door, and I was left alone, exhausted and disheartened. It was as if this argument had drained me more than I could imagine. Inside me was an emptiness that had grown over time with unspoken words and hidden resentments, and now it was hard to understand how the person I shared my life with could so abruptly push me away. Trying to catch my breath and calm down, I went to the bedroom, feeling a growing heaviness inside. The room was silent, deep and muffled, as if it absorbed all sounds and thoughts. I lay down on the bed, turning wearily onto my back and closing my eyes. My head spun slightly from the endless thoughts about how long I had felt forgotten, how much I missed that sense of belonging I felt with Mark at the beginning of our relationship. Trying to distract myself from these thoughts, I stared at the ceiling, as if a solution or at least temporary relief might be found there. But instead, images kept coming back to me, fragments of our life mixed with recent moments I had shared with Sam, warm yet innocent moments, and it brought me an inexplicable joy, just feeling that someone saw me again. Reflecting on all this, I heard someone enter the house. A quiet, almost cautious sound of footsteps. I already knew it wasn't Mark. His steps always had a bit more weight, a confidence that bordered on heaviness. These steps were soft, light. Sam. I realized he had returned, but I didn't know what exactly had brought him here at this moment. Of course, he didn't know about the argument, so he entered the house as he always did, calmly, without disturbing anyone. I heard him pass through the kitchen, and it seemed as if he was heading to his room. But his steps slowed, and I felt he was now near the bedroom door. The steps outside the door became quieter until he stepped over the threshold and carefully closed the door behind him. Inside, everything froze. My breath, thoughts, words, all mixed into a single knot of anticipation. And I just lay there, not turning, knowing that something inevitable was about to happen. Sam entered the room confidently, thinking it was his girlfriend inside, and I allowed that mistake to linger, as if I had become part of that moment, unwilling to break it. He came closer, sat down beside me, and his hand gently touched my shoulder. This gesture, so simple yet full of warmth, made me close my eyes at the feeling of long-forgotten excitement. He leaned in, his breath felt close, warm, near, almost intimate. Everything within me ignited and I could no longer step back. My mind seemed to remain outside the door, leaving me completely immersed in this moment, filled with his touches and my internal response. Sam leaned in closer, his lips brushed against my shoulder, sliding lightly over my skin with an almost shy kiss. I took a quiet breath, letting my body yield to this attraction I had been afraid to even think about so many times. His hand gently slid along my forearm, and in the weightlessness of his touch, I felt a passion pulsing between us both. He leaned in, his lips, warm and firm, covered mine, and I responded, completely forgetting everything around us. This kiss, full of tenderness and passion, seemed to break down all the barriers I had built, leaving us together in a single surge. I reached out to him, feeling him embrace me tighter, his hands confidently sliding along my back, drawing me closer, and in this embrace, everything that had long been hidden within me melted away. Every touch of his was careless and assured, his fingers explored every curve of my body, and I surrendered to this feeling as if it was the last chance to feel alive. In his hands, I was no longer just a wife or someone in the shadow of daily routine, but a woman who was seen, who was desired. We were too deeply immersed in this moment, and only when his hand accidentally brushed along my shoulder line as if noticing a small detail did he pause. Slowly he pulled back, and I noticed how his expression changed. As if realization was slowly dawning on him, he was realizing that it wasn't Emily before him. His expression shifted to surprise, confusion, then embarrassment. I, sensing he was about to pull away, held onto his hand and quietly whispered, "Let these moments be just ours, and we'll forget about everything around." My whisper was barely audible, but it seemed to break his doubts. He froze, and I reached out to him, covering his lips with another kiss. I understood that this was a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself or him. And we allowed ourselves to be entirely swept up by this feeling, allowing the passion to break the boundaries between us, forgetting everything that might have mattered, leaving only us in the room, Us and this unrestrained feeling that turned out to be stronger than all rules and prohibitions. After it all happened, Sam silently stood up, casting one last look at me, full of confusion and something unspoken. I heard his barely audible footsteps retreating down the hall, and after a few moments, I was left alone in the room, immersed in a silence that seemed deafening in its emptiness. I curled up on the bed, trying to hide under the blanket, but within me it felt as if a hurricane of thoughts and emotions had erupted. The memory of his touches, his gaze, of that fleeting, forbidden closeness that bound us and left an indelible mark, still pulsed. A short time later, I heard someone else enter the house. It was Mark. His confident footsteps shattered the silence that had enveloped the house, and each step echoed in my head. I lay still, feeling the weight of what had happened intensify. Mark probably sensed the tension, but seemed to attribute it to tiredness after the argument. No words, no attempts to talk from my side. We both drowned in our own silence. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of guilt that slowly and sticky-like seeped into memories of the night, which continued to come alive in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Sam, his touches, the feeling of his presence beside me would rise up. I felt simultaneously empty and filled with something new, torturous but sweet, as if I had opened a door beyond the ordinary life and found another reality where I could be myself, but had lost myself crossing the line. Sam was reserved, barely acknowledging me, as if there had been nothing between us. But I saw how he avoided my gaze, how he kept his distance. He skillfully concealed his feelings, but it was clear to me that the same emotions were churning inside him. He arrived for breakfast after everyone else, sitting across from me at the long wooden table, and I could feel his silent presence electrifying the atmosphere. We didn't make eye contact, but each time he leaned forward or made a small movement, memories of what had happened between us resurfaced. As I sat at the table, I tried not to look in his direction, but this only intensified the tension. Bits of memories, images that tormented me, floated up in my mind. I tried to find a way to push these thoughts away, to forget, to distance myself, but I felt that something in my heart wasn't ready to let go. I knew that what had happened wasn't just a fleeting spark, that it was something much more, something that had gone beyond a passing infatuation. Our gazes met for a moment, a short but weighted exchange, filled with questions for which we had no answers. The following days on the farm dragged on with unbearable slowness. I tried not to notice Sam, to avoid his gaze, but the more I attempted to keep my distance, the stronger the pull between us felt. Now, with each of his appearances, I not only felt inner excitement but also growing tension, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Emily, usually not the most attentive and observant by nature, suddenly started to show cautious interest in our behavior. Her gaze, typically detached and focused on her phone or her own concerns, now lingered just a bit longer when she looked at us. She began watching every movement, observing how we exchanged words, my nervous smile, and how Sam avoided unnecessary glances in my direction. I felt her suspicions growing, though I couldn't be sure she knew what was happening. And yet, this subtle shift in her behavior was troubling. She no longer asked lighthearted questions. Her tone and manner with Sam grew colder, and each look seemed to probe, to catch an invisible thread that tied us together. With each passing day, her wariness became more palpable, and whenever she was nearby, it felt like she noticed details she hadn't picked up on before. Mark, for his part, wasn't as observant as Emily, though occasionally his gaze lingered on us, though without any clear suspicion. He was always a straightforward person, viewing the world through his tasks and interests, not paying attention to details that didn't interfere with his plans. However, there was something different in his look. When I spoke with Sam, he seemed to sense the hidden tension, though he didn't give it much thought yet, but I knew he noticed. Each day it became harder to maintain this illusion of innocence. Every meal at the table, every chance encounter in the house or yard, every silence, all of it was filled with unspoken words that weighed on me more and more. I felt I was on the edge, and every small detail reminded me that everything could end at any moment, that any careless word or gesture could shatter the delicate facade under which I tried to hide my true feelings. But despite all the worries, I couldn't shake off what had happened between us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that night again, his touch, the warmth of his hands. I knew it was dangerous, that I was teetering on the edge of no return, but it felt as though this feeling was stronger than I was. Sam, despite his inner turmoil, couldn't go back to normal life either. His gaze, though careful, was filled with the same pain and inevitable attraction that bound us. We both understood that what had happened had changed something essential, and no matter how hard we tried to hide it, it was becoming increasingly obvious to those around us. This hidden connection between us filled me with both fear and desire. The house fell into an unusual silence. That day, everyone went off to their own tasks, and Sam and I were left alone inside, which, as it turned out, brought no relief. I could feel the invisible tension hovering between us, only growing since we were alone. I wanted to avoid his gaze, to avoid a conversation that clearly loomed, but Sam had no intention of backing down. "Lily." His voice was soft yet firm as he approached. "We need to talk." I felt everything tighten within me and took a step back, unwilling to meet his gaze. It seemed I was too close to the edge, where a simple word or casual gesture could ruin everything I had managed to keep hidden. "Sam, not now," I whispered, turning away and trying not to show how my hands slightly trembled. But he stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, yet held the same passion that bound us and made every meeting painfully impossible. "We can't pretend nothing happened, Lily," he whispered, leaning in. "This won't just go away on its own." I turned away, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he could hear it. I understood that everything we were doing was on the brink of recklessness, and I knew that at any second Emily could return to the house. She was in the garden, but the line between our secret and reality seemed almost illusory. All she had to do was walk through the door and it would all be over. I tensed, hoping he would understand that this was neither the time nor the place. "Lily?" His voice was filled with desperation, and he reached for my lips, trying to bridge the distance. But I instinctively turned away, resisting the temptation that hung over us. He paused, perhaps sensing my tension. At that moment, the creak of the front door broke the silence, and I instinctively stepped back, pretending to be busy with chores. Emily entered. She looked at us, slightly frowning, and a shadow of doubt crossed her face. She approached me, her expression tense, and I realized that hiding anything from her was becoming increasingly difficult. "Lily," she said softly, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What's going on between you and Sam?" I froze, feeling a prickle in my chest. The words stuck in my throat and I didn't know how to respond. Her question caught me off guard and I realized I could no longer hide. Sam also froze at that moment. I saw him come to terms with the fact that our feelings and actions could be exposed to everyone. But in his gaze, there was determination. He wasn't going to retreat, even if everything came to light. Emily's question hung in the air, and I understood that every second of my silence only confirmed her suspicions. Looking into her eyes, I felt myself overtaken by fear. Fear for all our secrets, for what we had built on fleeting moments. I needed to come up with an answer quickly, something believable, but all I managed was a forced smile. "Emily, are you serious?" I joked, trying to make my voice sound light. "We're just spending time together. After all, there aren't many things to do around here. It's just your imagination, nothing more." Emily continued to watch me, her suspicions far from dispelled, and I could see the wariness in her eyes growing stronger with each passing minute. The conversation ended, but a heavy silence hung in the air, difficult to escape. I understood that her suspicions had only intensified, and now she would surely be looking for confirmation of her assumptions. Sam stood beside me, silent and tense. He knew that mere words wouldn't resolve this situation. We both felt that things were spiraling out of control, and this opaque mask with which we'd covered our feelings was becoming increasingly thin. When Emily left, I stayed in the living room, trying to catch my breath and handle the rising panic. I hadn't noticed that Mark, being in his room, overheard part of our conversation. Likely, Emily's words and my clumsy response had reached him, leaving him ample space for speculation. Of course, he didn't understand the whole picture, but his expression, when he finally came down to the living room, seemed wary. It was one of those rare instances where his gaze held a spark, as if he was trying to piece together separate fragments of a puzzle, though he hadn't yet found a logical explanation. An exhaustion fell upon me, tearing me apart from within. I felt trapped, not knowing how to escape this whirlwind. All that Sam and I had done had shattered my internal balance, and I no longer knew how to regain myself. I was lost in my own world, where love and guilt intertwined into a knot that made it hard to breathe. There was no place for regret or excuses, only the feeling that we had gone too far and that the way out was now behind us. Late at night, when the house was already quiet, I realized I needed to speak to Sam alone. We both needed clarity, even if it would bring pain. I made my way to him, barely tapping on his door. Sam opened it, his face reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and tense expectation. "We need to talk," I said quietly, feeling that there was no point in dragging it out. He nodded, inviting me in. The room was filled with dim light, and the silence between us was thick and almost oppressive. I sat across from him, feeling my hands tremble as I tried to gather my thoughts. "Everything that happened, it changed us both, Sam," I began, trying not to look away. "But I'm not sure we can keep going like this. I'm afraid that this story will destroy us." He lowered his gaze, his face tense and closed. He understood exactly what I was saying, but his expression showed he wasn't ready to let go of everything between us so easily. "Do you really think we can just forget all this?" His voice was restrained, but I could feel the pain in it. "Everything we felt. I can't just pretend it never existed." The words got stuck in my throat, and I realized that this decision was the hardest I'd ever had to make. At night, when the entire house had fallen asleep, I quietly stepped outside into the garden. The sky was a deep navy, stars twinkling above us, and the silence filled the space, leaving room only for our own thoughts. I knew that Sam was waiting for me. We both understood this conversation was inevitable. The recent events, the tension, the silent glances, all of it had pushed us to the edge where perhaps we might find some answer to the questions tearing us apart. He was standing under the apple tree, barely visible in the faint moonlight. We both felt as though we were on the verge of something terrible and unavoidable. I approached him, my heart beating heavily, though this time not with excitement but with the awareness that our connection had become something destructive. "Sam," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, though it still trembled. "We can't keep doing this. It's gone too far, and maybe we need to let it go." He was silent, his face tense, but his eyes, reflecting the moonlight, showed his pain. He didn't respond immediately, as if he was fighting within himself, trying to process what I had said. "I know," he whispered, taking a step closer. "But you understand, Lily, that we can never just forget this? I can't pretend nothing happened, or that we're strangers." His words pierced me, and I knew he was right. All these feelings, the passion that connected us, it was impossible to just erase them. We stood in silence, in this thick tension full of unspoken words, and I realized that despite everything I told myself, it was hard to break this connection. It was as if we were consuming each other, and this attraction was stronger than I could have imagined. But while we spoke, in the darkness of the garden, I didn't notice that nearby stood Emily, who had overheard our conversation. She was silent, her eyes filled with tears, both from betrayal and the realization that her suspicions had been true. Sam and I were absorbed in our own tragedy, unaware of her presence, and only after some time, when she quietly turned and left, did I feel her absence, like a cold trace left in the night. In the morning, everything came to light. Emily, having crushed the last remnants of trust and love, went to Mark and told him everything she knew. She told him about all her suspicions, about hearing strange sounds from our room on the night Mark and I argued. She had seen Sam leaving my room since then, and her doubts had only grown. That night confirmed all her worst fears. Mark entered the house just as I was waking up, and the look in his eyes was full of anger he could no longer hold back. For the first time, I saw all bridges collapsing, the warm connection that once united us dying. "How could you?" His voice was full of pain and disappointment, and I felt a heaviness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family. Sam, did you really sink that low?" Everything crumbled like a house of cards, and nothing could restore the lost trust. Shortly after, Sam appeared, his face pale, his eyes filled with remorse mixed with bitterness. "Both of you," Mark sighed, casting a dark look upon us. "You are no longer family to me. Get out of here. I don't need your explanations or apologies." These words, spoken with such cold determination, severed all ties we still had to this house. Sam and I left, leaving behind the fragments of shattered lives and the people we had once loved. I understood that our passion had destroyed everything we had, and now there was no going back. Sam and I walked off the farm under the weight of all that we had ruined. The familiar fields stretched around us, but at that moment they felt strange and unwelcoming. Everything that once connected us to this place stayed behind with the remnants of a life that had once been calm and familiar. We walked to the car in silence, neither of us daring to look at each other, as if even a single glance could spark a new wave of regret and pain. When we reached the city, it became clear there was nothing left to say. Sam, barely looking at me, gave a faint smile as if saying goodbye. His eyes held a sadness with which he made his decision, and in his words, there was an understanding. Everything needed to end here and now. We both knew we couldn't continue, that every step forward would only lead to more destruction. "It's probably for the best, Lily," he said quietly. "We both know there's no going back. And if we want to keep any part of ourselves, it's better to leave everything here." Though his words were filled with bitterness, they sounded like a release. I nodded, trying to hide the emotions overwhelming me, and without looking back, walked away, feeling that this last goodbye was tearing me away from all the memories filled with both pain and fleeting happiness. Alone in my apartment, I suddenly realized just how much everything had changed. The home that had once felt cozy and filled with memories of my life with Mark now seemed empty and cold. Everything around reminded me of the choices I had made, the decisions that had brought me to this point. I had lost not only my husband, my home, and all that had once been dear to us, but also my own trust in myself. I had shattered the image I'd carried for all these years, and now I was left to figure out who I truly was. Everything I had valued was destroyed by this passion, a fleeting fascination that spiraled out of control and led to the collapse of my life. It was hard to find an excuse or explanation for my actions. Every moment spent with Sam had turned into emptiness, leaving only bitterness and regret. And although I knew that nothing could bring back the past, I kept asking myself, how do I go on, knowing I had destroyed everything I once had? The evening came, and as I sat alone in the room, I realized that only uncertainty lay ahead.